Imagine standing on a dusty road beneath a darkening sky. The wind begins to rise, not gently, but with a force that feels almost alive. Then, suddenly, the heavens seem to tear open, and out of that storm descends something impossible. A chariot of fire, blazing with an intensity no human forge could ever produce, pulled by horses made of flame. It does not merely appear. It commands the sky, illuminating the earth below with a fierce, otherworldly light. And in the midst of it all stands a man, calm, unwavering, as he is lifted from the ground and carried upward into the unknown. What really happened to Elijah? Is it possible that a human being could leave this world without ever tasting death? Before we go deeper into this mystery, take a moment to follow the journey. Subscribe and stay connected, because stories like this are not just ancient history. They challenge how we understand faith, power, and what lies beyond life itself. To understand that final, breathtaking moment, we have to go back to a time when the land of Israel was no longer faithful to the God it once followed. The nation had turned away, seduced by the worship of Baal, a false god promising rain, fertility, and prosperity. Altars to Baal stood where devotion to the true God once thrived. Kings no longer led with righteousness, and truth had become something dangerous. It was into this spiritual collapse that Elijah emerged. He did not come with wealth, status, or an army. He came with conviction. Elijah was a prophet, but not the kind who spoke cautiously or sought approval. He was bold, confrontational, and utterly certain of the voice he followed. In a world that had grown comfortable with compromise, Elijah refused to bend. He stood alone when necessary, not because he lacked fear, but because his faith outweighed it. His courage was most clearly seen in his defiance of the king himself. To stand against a ruler in ancient Israel was not merely risky, it was often a death sentence. Yet Elijah delivered a message that could not be ignored. The land would suffer a devastating drought, and not a drop of rain would fall unless God commanded it. It was a direct challenge, not only to the king's authority, but to Baal himself, who was believed to control the skies. And then the rain stopped. Days turned into months, and months into years. The earth cracked under the relentless sun. Crops failed, rivers dried. Even the king began to realize that Elijah's words were not empty threats, they carried power. But this was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. Eventually, everything led to a single, decisive moment on Mount Carmel. There, Elijah stood against hundreds of prophets of Baal in a test that would reveal the truth once and for all. 2 altars were prepared, 2 sacrifices laid out. The challenge was simple. Call upon your God, and whichever deity answers with fire would be proven real. The prophets of Baal went first. They cried out for hours, dancing, shouting, even injuring themselves in desperation. But the sky remained silent. No fire came. Then Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord, carefully, deliberately, as if restoring something that had been forgotten. He drenched the sacrifice in water, once, twice, until it was soaked beyond reason. And then he prayed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet authority that came from certainty. Moments later, fire fell from heaven. It did not simply ignite the offering, it consumed everything. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water itself vanished in a blaze of divine power. In that instant, the illusion shattered. The people could no longer deny what they had seen. But victory did not bring peace. Instead, it brought danger. The queen, furious at the humiliation of her prophets, swore to have Elijah killed. Suddenly, the man who had faced down an entire nation found himself running for his life. He fled into the wilderness, alone, exhausted, and overwhelmed. This is where the story becomes unexpectedly human. Elijah, the great prophet, reached a breaking point. He questioned his purpose. He felt isolated, as if everything he had done had led him to emptiness. For a moment, the strength that defined him seemed to fade. Yet even there, in that silence, he was not abandoned. God met him not in fire or storm, but in a quiet whisper, a reminder that he was not alone, that his mission was not over, and that there were still plans unfolding beyond what he could see. Elijah was renewed, not through spectacle, but through presence. It was during this time that another figure entered the story, Elisha. Younger, determined, and fiercely loyal, Elisha chose to follow Elijah completely. When the time came, he refused to leave his side, even when urged to stay behind. He understood that something extraordinary was about to happen. Their final journey together was marked by a sense of inevitability. Step by step, they moved toward the Jordan River. There, Elijah performed one last miracle, striking the water so that it parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. It was a moment that echoed the great acts of the past, as if history itself was preparing for what came next. Then, without warning, the atmosphere changed. The wind rose again, the sky darkened, and suddenly, that same vision from the beginning became reality. A chariot of fire, blazing and unstoppable, descended between them. In an instant, Elijah was taken, lifted into the heavens in a whirlwind of flame and power. No death, no grave, no final breath, just departure. Elisha stood there, watching as his mentor vanished into the sky. It was a moment of awe, grief, and realization all at once. The man he had followed was gone, but not lost. And as the fire faded, something remained behind. Elijah's cloak. It fell to the ground, a symbol not of an ending, but of continuation. Elisha picked it up, understanding what it meant. The mission had not ended with Elijah, it had been passed on. And when Elisha returned to the river and struck it with the cloak, the waters parted once again. The power, the purpose, the calling, it all continued. And so, the story of Elijah does not conclude with disappearance, but with transformation. It reminds us that faith can defy expectation, that endings are not always what they seem, and that sometimes the most extraordinary exits are not about leaving, but about what is left behind. The tension that had been quietly building beneath the surface of Israel's spiritual decline was about to erupt into open conflict. Elijah's presence alone was already unsettling to the royal court, but it was his message that turned unease into hostility. He did not speak in riddles or soften his words to protect himself. Instead, he confronted power directly, naming the corruption, exposing the false worship, and calling for repentance in a land that had grown resistant to truth. At the center of this conflict stood Ahab, a ruler whose authority was overshadowed by compromise, and beside him, the far more relentless force of Jezebel. Together, they had reshaped the religious landscape of Israel, elevating Baal worship and silencing those who remained faithful to the true God. Under their rule, deception was not only tolerated, it was institutionalized. Elijah did not attempt diplomacy. He issued a declaration that cut through illusion with devastating clarity. There would be no rain, no dew, no relief, except at his word, and by extension, at the command of the God he served. It was not merely a prophecy, it was a direct assault on Baal's supposed dominion over nature. And then, the heavens closed. What followed was not immediate chaos, but a slow, grinding collapse. The land began to wither. Streams shrank into stagnant pools before disappearing entirely. Fields that once yielded abundance turned brittle and lifeless. Hunger crept in quietly at first, then spread with undeniable force. Livestock weakened. Communities fractured under the pressure of scarcity. Even the royal house could not shield itself from the consequences. In this drawn-out crisis, Elijah became both a fugitive and a symbol. The king searched for him relentlessly, not in pursuit of reconciliation, but to silence the voice that had proven dangerously accurate. Yet Elijah remained beyond reach, sustained in ways that defied logic, as if the same power that withheld the rain was preserving him for something still to come. That something would not remain hidden forever. Eventually, the silence broke, not with rain, but with a summons. Elijah stepped out of obscurity and into confrontation once more, calling for a gathering that would force a definitive answer. The stage was set at Mount Carmel, a place elevated both physically and symbolically, where the question of truth could no longer be avoided. The challenge was stark in its simplicity: two sides, two altars, two claims to divine authority. The prophets of Baal, numerous and confident, would call upon their God. Elijah, alone, would call upon his. The response, if any came, would settle the matter beyond argument. The people gathered, not merely as spectators, but as witnesses to a moment that would define their understanding of reality itself. The prophets of Baal began first. Their rituals were intense, elaborate, and relentless. They called out, danced, pleaded, escalating their efforts as time passed without result. Hours stretched on under the heat of the sun. Their voices grew hoarse, their movements more desperate. What had begun with confidence slowly shifted into anxiety, then into a kind of frantic insistence, as if volume and persistence could force a response. But the sky remained silent. No fire, no sign, no acknowledgement. Elijah's turn came not with spectacle, but with precision. He approached the altar with a deliberate calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos before him. Stone by stone, he rebuilt what had been broken, restoring the altar of the Lord as an act of both memory and defiance. Then, in a move that defied practical reasoning, he ordered water to be poured over the offering, not once, but repeatedly, until everything was saturated. In a time of drought, this act alone carried weight. It removed any possibility of manipulation, any suspicion of trickery. What followed was not a performance. It was a prayer, brief, direct, and unembellished. And then, without warning, the response came. Fire fell. It did not descend gradually or flicker uncertainly. It struck with absolute force, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water that had soaked the altar. In a single moment, ambiguity vanished. The question that had lingered over the nation was answered with undeniable clarity. The reaction was immediate. The people, confronted with what they had witnessed, could no longer remain divided in their allegiance. The illusion of Baal's power collapsed under the weight of reality. What had been hidden beneath layers of ritual and tradition was exposed as empty. For Elijah, this should have been the turning point, the moment where victory translated into safety, where truth established stability. But reality proved more complex. Rather than bringing resolution, the event at Mount Carmel intensified the danger. Jezebel did not interpret the outcome as a reason to reconsider. She saw it as an attack, personal, political, and intolerable. Her response was swift and uncompromising. Elijah would die. The shift was immediate and profound. The man who had stood alone before hundreds, who had called down fire from heaven, now found himself running, not toward confrontation, but away from it. The transition feels almost abrupt, even contradictory. Yet it reveals something essential. Courage in one moment does not eliminate vulnerability in the next. Elijah fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the place of triumph and entering a landscape that mirrored his internal state, dry, empty, and isolating. The physical exhaustion was evident, but it was the psychological weight that pressed more heavily. The threat against his life was real, but so was the realization that even after such a decisive demonstration of power, the opposition remained unchanged. This is where the narrative shifts from public spectacle to private struggle. Removed from the crowd, stripped of the immediate urgency of confrontation, Elijah faced something far more difficult: his own thoughts. The clarity that had guided him seemed to blur. The purpose that once felt unshakable now appeared distant. He had challenged a nation, proven a point beyond dispute, and yet, in the aftermath, he was alone, still hunted, still opposed, still uncertain of what would come next. He reached a point where continuation felt heavier than surrender. There, in that isolation, Elijah expressed a desire not for victory, but for release. It was not dramatic in the way Mount Carmel had been. It was quieter, more subdued, but no less intense. He had given everything, and it felt as though it had changed nothing. This moment is critical, not because it diminishes Elijah, but because it reveals the cost of what he carried. Faith, in this context, is not presented as constant strength, but as persistence through fluctuation. The same man who had stood unshaken before kings and false prophets now struggled to hold on to the very purpose that had defined him. And yet, this was not the end of his story, because the narrative does not abandon him in that state. Instead, it pauses, creating space for something different to occur. Not another display of overwhelming power, not another confrontation, but an encounter that would address the deeper exhaustion beneath the surface. Elijah had confronted kings, nations, and false gods. Now, he was confronting himself. What happened next did not resemble anything that had come before. There was no thunder, no fire falling from the sky, no dramatic confrontation to prove a point. Instead, the story slowed, almost deliberately, as if drawing attention away from spectacle and towards something quieter, but no less powerful. In the depth of Elijah's exhaustion, when strength had given way to silence, the intervention of God came, not as a display meant for crowds, but as a response meant for one man. Elijah had expected judgment, perhaps even an end. What he encountered instead was care. He was given rest before he was given answers. Food appeared where there had been none. Water was provided in a place defined by scarcity. And more than once, he was told simply to rise and eat, as though the first step in restoring a broken spirit was not correction, but renewal. It is easy to overlook the significance of this moment, but it reframes everything. The same God who had demonstrated overwhelming power on Mount Carmel now chose to restore through patience and provision. Only after Elijah regained some measure of strength did the deeper encounter take place. He found himself drawn to a mountain, a place already marked by history, a place where divine presence had once been revealed in unmistakable ways. There, Elijah waited. And as he waited, the environment around him began to shift. A powerful wind tore through the landscape, strong enough to break rocks apart. It was the kind of force that demands attention, the kind that seems worthy of divine association. But the presence of God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, shaking the ground beneath him, disrupting everything stable and familiar. Again, it seemed like the kind of moment where power would manifest. But God was not in the earthquake. After that, fire appeared, something Elijah knew well, something that had defined his greatest public triumph. Yet even here, in the very element that once confirmed his calling before an entire nation, the presence he needed was absent. And then, finally, came something almost imperceptible. A whisper. Not a voice that commanded the sky, not a force that altered the landscape, but something quiet enough that it required attention rather than fear. It was in that stillness that Elijah encountered God, not as a distant authority demanding results, but as a presence that understood his condition completely. This moment redefined Elijah's understanding of how God works. Power had its place, but it was not the only language. Sometimes, the most significant intervention comes not through overwhelming force, but through precise, personal restoration. And within that quiet exchange, Elijah was given something he had not expected, a renewed assignment. His journey was not over. Despite his fear, despite his sense of failure, despite the unresolved opposition that still existed, he was told to return, not to retreat further, but to re-engage. There were still kings to confront, still outcomes to shape, still a future that extended beyond his current perception. And most importantly, he was instructed to prepare for what would come after him, because Elijah was never meant to carry the mission alone. It is at this point that another figure steps into focus, not suddenly, but with a sense of inevitability that suggests he had always been part of the plan. Elisha enters the narrative not as a replacement, but as a continuation. Their first encounter is simple, almost understated. Elijah approaches him not with a speech, but with a gesture, casting his cloak over him. In that culture, the meaning was unmistakable. It was not just an invitation, it was a calling. And Elisha understood immediately. He did not hesitate, negotiate, or delay. What he was being asked to leave behind was significant: family, stability, identity. But he recognized that what lay ahead carried greater weight. His response was decisive. He chose to follow. From that point forward, the relationship between Elijah and Elisha was not merely teacher and student. It was a transfer in progress. Elisha observed, learned, and remained close, not out of obligation, but out of conviction. He saw something in Elijah's life that could not be explained by circumstance alone, and he committed himself to understanding it fully. As time passed, it became increasingly clear that this relationship was moving toward a defined moment. Elijah's role, though still active, was approaching its conclusion. Elisha seemed to sense this before it was ever stated openly. There was an urgency in his loyalty, a refusal to be separated, even when given multiple opportunities to remain behind. Again and again, Elijah tested that resolve. At each stage of their journey, he suggested that Elisha stay where he was, that he not continue further. But each time, Elisha refused. His response was consistent, unwavering. As long as Elijah lived, he would not leave him. This persistence was not emotional dependence, it was intentional. Elisha understood that proximity mattered, that to receive what was coming, he had to remain present until the very end. And so, they traveled together. Their path took them through multiple locations, each one marking a step closer to the inevitable. There was a rhythm to their movement, almost ceremonial, as if each place they passed through held its own significance in the unfolding transition. Observers along the way seemed aware that something unusual was about to occur. There were hints, quiet acknowledgements, a shared recognition that Elijah's departure was near. But the journey did not stop. Eventually, they arrived at the banks of the Jordan River, a boundary not just of geography, but of meaning. The Jordan had always represented transition, a crossing from one state into another. And here, at this familiar yet symbolic location, Elijah performed one final act that echoed the great moments of the past. He took his cloak, the same one that had marked his identity, and struck the water. The response was immediate. The river parted, not gradually, not subtly, but decisively, creating a path where none existed, allowing them to cross on dry ground. It was a moment that carried both memory and anticipation. It reflected the authority Elijah had carried throughout his life, but it also pointed forward, suggesting that what was about to happen would not be an end, but a continuation under new hands. They crossed together. On the other side, the atmosphere shifted once again, not with chaos, but with expectation. The journey had reached its final stage, and it was here, in this space set apart from distraction, that Elijah turned to Elisha with a question that carried profound weight. "What can I do for you before I am taken from you?" It was not a casual offer. It was an acknowledgement that the moment of separation had arrived. Elisha's answer revealed everything about his understanding of what he had been part of. He did not ask for status, recognition, or ease. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. He recognized that what Elijah had carried was not merely personal strength, but a calling that demanded capacity beyond the ordinary. Elijah's response was measured. It was not something he could grant directly. Instead, he set a condition, one that required presence, attention, and readiness. If Elisha saw him when he was taken, then what he had asked for would be granted. And so, they stood there, on the edge of something that had never happened before, knowing that the next moment would redefine everything that came after. The moment did not announce itself with a clear beginning. There was no countdown, no signal that would allow either of them to prepare in the way people usually prepare for endings. Instead, it unfolded the way the most significant moments often do, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with something that could not be explained by natural means. The stillness broke, not into chaos, but into motion, sudden, forceful, undeniable. A wind began to rise, circling them with increasing intensity. It was not the ordinary movement of air across open land. It was focused, deliberate, as though it had purpose. Dust lifted from the ground, spiraling upward. The sky darkened, not with storm clouds in the usual sense, but with a presence that seemed to press in from above. Elisha did not look away. He remembered the condition. He understood what was at stake. Whatever fear might have tried to take hold, he held his ground. His attention did not waver, even as the wind intensified into something closer to a whirlwind, pulling at everything around them, blurring the boundary between earth and sky. And then it appeared. Not emerging from a distance, not gradually forming, but suddenly, fully present, unmistakable. A chariot of fire, blazing with a brightness that defied comprehension, accompanied by horses equally consumed in flame. It did not behave like something bound by the laws of the physical world. It moved with authority, cutting through the space between Elijah and Elisha, separating them in a single, decisive motion. There was no time for final words, no extended farewell. The separation itself was the signal. In the force of that moment, Elijah was taken, lifted from the ground, drawn upward into the heart of the whirlwind. It was not a fall, not a struggle, not even a departure in the way people typically understand leaving. It was an ascent, intentional, direct, and complete. Higher and higher he went, carried not by his own strength, but by something far beyond it. No death, no stillness, no grave left behind to mark the place where his life had ended. Instead, there was only absence, and the undeniable awareness that what had just occurred did not fit within the boundaries of ordinary human experience. Elisha watched until he could no longer see him. The sky, which moments before had been filled with fire and motion, returned to its quiet state. The wind subsided, the dust settled, and what remained was not noise, but silence, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. In that silence, the weight of what had happened became clear. Elijah was gone. Not defeated, not taken by illness or age, but removed, called away in a manner that confirmed everything his life had pointed toward. It was not merely an ending, it was a validation. The same God who had sustained him, spoken to him, and worked through him had now brought his journey on earth to a close in a way that transcended expectation. For a moment, Elisha responded not as a successor, but as a disciple. He cried out, not in confusion, but in recognition of loss. The one he had followed, learned from, and remained beside until the very end was no longer there. The relationship that had shaped his path was suddenly transformed. What had been external, visible, audible, tangible, was now gone. But the story did not end with absence, because something had been left behind. As the last traces of the whirlwind faded, Elisha noticed it. The cloak. The same cloak that had once been placed upon him as a sign of calling now lay on the ground. It had not been taken with Elijah. It had not disappeared into the sky. It remained, as if intentionally, within reach. This was not an accident. It was a transfer. Elisha approached it, not casually, but with awareness. He understood what it represented. Not just the memory of Elijah, but the continuation of everything Elijah had carried. The authority, the responsibility, the connection to the divine purpose that had defined his mentor's life. All of it was now, in some sense, placed before him. He picked it up. And in that action, something shifted. The question was no longer whether Elijah had been taken. That had already been answered. The question now was whether what Elijah had embodied would continue, and if so, through whom. Elisha did not hesitate. He turned back toward the Jordan River, the same boundary they had crossed together only moments before. The water flowed as it always had, unchanged by what had just occurred nearby. But Elisha stood at its edge with the cloak in his hand, facing not just the river, but the reality of what he was now stepping into. There was no audience, no gathering of witnesses, no visible confirmation that what he was about to do would succeed. Only a choice. He struck the water. For a brief moment, nothing seemed to happen, just long enough for doubt to be possible. And then, just as it had before, the river responded. The waters parted, drawing back to create a path where none had existed. It was the answer. Not spoken, not explained, but demonstrated. The same power that had worked through Elijah was now present with Elisha. The transition was complete, not in theory, but in reality. What had been asked for, a double portion, a continuation, an expansion, was now beginning to unfold. Elisha crossed, and with each step, the role he had once observed became the role he now carried. The journey ahead would be different. The challenges would take new forms. But the foundation remained the same. The mission had not ended with Elijah's departure. It had moved forward. This is where the meaning of the entire story begins to sharpen. Because what happened was not simply an isolated miracle meant to impress or astonish. It was a statement, one that extends beyond the individuals involved. Elijah's life demonstrated that faith, when held firmly, does not depend on majority opinion, political power, or cultural acceptance. He stood against systems that were deeply entrenched and widely accepted, and yet his conviction did not shift. That alone would have been significant. But his departure adds another dimension. It suggests that the boundaries people assume, especially the boundary of death, are not absolute in the way they appear. Elijah did not escape difficulty. He faced opposition, fear, and exhaustion. But his story does not conclude in defeat or even in a conventional ending. It concludes in transition, one that points beyond the visible world. At the same time, the story refuses to center everything on one individual. Elisha's role makes that clear. The work continues, the purpose extends. The plan was never limited to a single person, no matter how significant that person might have been. What Elijah began did not disappear with him. It expanded through someone willing to remain, to learn, and to step forward when the moment required it. And this leads to a final implication, one that lingers long after the details of the story have settled. What seems impossible is not always unreachable. A drought that reshaped a nation, fire that answered from heaven, a man taken without dying, a river that parted at the strike of a cloak. None of these fit within ordinary expectations. And yet, within the framework of this story, they are not presented as random anomalies, but as expressions of a larger reality, one that operates beyond human limitation. That does not make them easy to understand, but it does make them difficult to dismiss, because at its core, this is not just a story about what happened to Elijah. It is a story about what happens when belief persists beyond fear, when purpose continues beyond transition, and when the limits people accept are confronted by something greater than themselves. And perhaps that is why the image of that chariot still lingers, not simply as a spectacle in the sky, but as a reminder that the line between the possible and the impossible is not always where we think it is.